So Matthew's gospel in chapter 13 particularly is like, it's a treasure trove of Jesus' parables. And so I picked out 3 more of them for the gospel reading today. The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field. When a man found it, he hid it again. And then in his joy went and sold all that he had and bought that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant looking for fine pearls. When he found one of great value, he went away and sold everything he had and bought it. Once again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was let down into the lake and caught all kinds of fish. When it was full, the fishermen pulled it up on the shore. Then they sat down and collected the good fish in baskets, but threw the bad away. This is how it will be at the end of the age. The angel will come and separate the wicked from the righteous. These are words inspired by God. So the theme that I chose for February was the theme of the parables of Jesus. But when I'm dealing with any interesting topic, what I love to do is to try to deal with it as a series of concentric circles. I look to have a look at it like from a kind of more a cosmic perspective, and then slowly by slowly work my way into the center, into the bullseye. And so 2 weeks ago, I looked at the kind of the cosmic perspective, on language and teachings and spirituality, and I worked my way in slowly. And then last week, I specifically narrowed it down to the actual parables of Jesus. So today then, I'll do a recap of the last 2 homilies and then open up to a question and answer series. So I started 2 weeks ago by looking at the biggest part I could think about, and that is kind of what I call the evolution of earth consciousness. So I believe that God's love incarnates in our cosmos in 3 great stages. So starting with the love of God, the first kind of manifestation of that love is light. And we know from physics that, in fact, all matter is frozen light. It's composed of photons. And then the second part was the logos, which I call the morphological agent, that which gives shape and form to light. And then thirdly, the dance of light and logos create life. So the image I use is that in some senses, light is like the clay, logos is the potter, and life is the finished product. And so the clay left to its own devices is kind of just lying there. It needs some kind of a morphological agent, something that can give it form and shape and texture. And that's the function of the potter. And then the product is life. The finished product is life. So when I look at that then, as I look at the evolution of consciousness on our planet, we start off with inanimate matter, like rocks. And rocks can only react in some senses to chemicals and environmental influences, whether it's from the sun or the rain or the wind or the snow or earthquakes or volcanoes or waves or whatever. And so all movement of inanimate matter is movement which is created by some kinds of outside agents. So in some senses, that was the first stage of the coming of consciousness to planet Earth. Then at some stage, flora emerge from this. And the movement, flora is the movement of life forces with an inner orientation. So the life force from within the flora are kind of moving in charge of its movements. So you have a sunflower which orients to the sun. You have fungi and individual trees and entire forest ecosystems that are orienting to particular kinds of things, but they're moving on their own. It's not just that they're subject to outside forces. And I give the example, where I live, I'm surrounded, at some stage of the year with California poppies. And I look at them in the morning and they're all closed up. They have 4 petals, 4 golden petals, and they're completely closed up. And then as the sun comes out, they begin to open up to the sun. And then when it comes to evening time, they close back down again. It's like they're going to sleep, or they're ready for their dream state, or they're going to a different level of consciousness. So that's the movement then of flora, that it's an inner orientation, driven by an inner orientation. You then get to fauna, and now fauna are moving their feet or their flippers or their wings in order to even geographically relocate. So it's not like they're just orienting to the movements of the sun, but that, some birds can fly halfway around the world twice a year in their migrations. So now fauna have this ability to move of their own volition. The next stage then was the arrival of hominids. And hominids are, they're reacting consciously to both present opportunities or present predicaments on the basis of previous experiences. So it's not that we're just reacting to environmental situations in the now, but we can actually remember consciously and look at present opportunities or present difficulties, on the basis of previous experiences, and then decide what course of action is most opportune. And then at some stage among the hominids, we had the self-aware hominids. And now they have the ability to self-reflect on the positive and negative impacts of previous behavior. Now they can remember back to situations that look like the one I'm in right now, and to figure out that I did, A happened and I did B. B worked perfectly, so I'll do A again. Or I did C and D happened and I didn't like D, so I'm not going to repeat C again. So self-aware hominids have this ability to self-reflect on both the positive and negative impacts of previous behavior. Now, there's another term I like to use. I call it metacognition. And metacognition is the ability to factor in the effects, not just of previous behavior, but also of previous motivations and desires. Now we're going much, much more deeply. We're not just looking back to kind of the behavior, the externalization of our inner thinking, but also to the motivations we had and the desires that led us to make the decisions we made. And that I would call it kind of a metacognition. And then a term I would like to invent is supercognition. And for me, supercognition is the ability to see life, its evolution, and its teleology from a divine perspective. So it's not just that I'm going back and looking at my motivations or my desires or my behavior. I have the ability to supercognize, the ability to see the entire life trajectory and its evolution, its history, and its teleology from a divine perspective. And as far as I'm concerned, this is the level from which the great mystical avatars, like the Jesus figures or the Buddha figures or the Lao Tzu figures, this is the level that these great mystical avatars, is from there that they deliver their teachings. So when they're talking, they're not just talking cognitively, they're not even just talking metacognitively, they're talking from a superconscious state where they're thinking as God thinks. So that was the first kind of the outer circle that I talk about. The next concentric circle as I came in, I spoke about oral and written languages. So about 200,000 years ago, with the advent of Homo sapiens, beings arrived. Homo sapiens mean the wise ones. We could reason. So we were rational beings, but we didn't have language skill. That only came much later with Homo sapiens sapiens, which happened about 70,000 years ago. And now for the first time ever, these hominids had language capabilities. And language is the ability to think about thinking. So until you can think about thinking, this is kind of the manipulation intrapsychically of symbols of various kinds. And then we learn how to express it in either words or images through some kind of an art form or dance or in words. And so the advent of language was another movement. And then at some stage, much, much, much later, came written versions of this, that we could express our inner images in written languages. And the very first one of those happened in Sumeria, which would be modern-day Iraq. It was called cuneiform, and it happened about 3,200 years BC, so more than 5,000 years ago. And they developed this script, very, very complex with hundreds of symbols to record on stone. Shortly afterwards came hieroglyphics in Egypt. That goes back to about 3,100 BC. Now, the problem with these two systems was they demanded hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of symbols in order to record, written language. The Phoenicians, about the year 1100 BC, came up with a brilliant idea where they could parse human speech into basic phonemes. A phoneme is the shortest sound a human voice can make. It's shorter even than a syllable. So sometimes, even a single syllable has two or more phonemes. So if you take, for instance, the word in English, the word I went to the shop yesterday. The word I is a single letter, but it's two phonemes. It is I. But you say it so quickly, it sounds like a single thing. It's I. There are two phonemes, A and E, and they pronounce I sound. So they reduced all of the known languages of which they were capable of uttering into 22 basic symbols. And the interesting thing was that could be imported into any language throughout the world, because we're basically making the same basic sounds, until you meet perhaps a group like Drung in South Africa with the click sounds, and that you then have to extend. And so they came up with symbols for the consonants. So strictly speaking, it wasn't yet an alphabet. It's called an abjad. And the Phoenicians, and subsequently in Aramaic and in Hebrew, there were just 22 symbols. So even modern day Hebrew has no signs for the vowels. If you read an Israeli newspaper, there are only consonants written. You have to infer the vowels from the context. So the Greeks then came after the Phoenicians, and they added signs for the vowel signs. And now we strictly have an alphabet where all of the sounds that the human voice can make are represented, both the consonants and the vowels. I talked about then that when we look in our world right now, and there are in the region of about 5,000 different languages being spoken on planet Earth right now. But some of them are fairly new, and some of the other ones have disappeared. So when you look at the languages which are currently spoken, and you look at the kind of how old these languages are, they've come down as follows. The Egyptian, as it's spoken today, goes back to about 2,690 BCE. So it's almost 4,700 years old. The next language to arrive was Sanskrit from about 1500 BCE, which makes it about 3,500 years old. Then Greek came very, very quickly afterwards, modern Greek. So it's 1450 BCE, so making it again about 3,500 years old. Then Chinese arrives about 1250 BCE, so it's 3,300 years old. Aramaic arrives around 1100 BCE, which makes it 3,100 years old. Hebrew came about 100 years after Aramaic, so it came from about 1000 BCE, which makes it 3,000 years old now. Then Farsi came in the year 522 BCE, and that makes it about 2,500 years old. Tamil came then next from about 300 BCE, which makes it about 2,300 years old. Italian came about 100 BCE, which makes it 2,100 years old. And then Korean came in 57 BCE, which makes it again about 2,100 years old. So when we look at the 5,000 languages being spoken, we can kind of gauge at this stage, what gave birth to what. So that was the next kind of the circle that I spoke about. Then I wanted to look specifically, the next circle in was the eras and the languaging of God. When we started speaking of the divinities, what was the progress of language here? And so at the first stage, I believe, I think it was the language of the theologians, where we began to speak about the gods, and there were a pluriformity of gods at that stage. So theology is kind of the first language of God. So we're speaking about the gods. After that came the priests, the language of the priests. And where theologians are speaking about the gods, priests are attempting to speak to the gods. So they create prayer and ritual in order to now engage with these beings whom theologians have told them exist. The third level then I call the era of the prophets. And these are people who purport to speak on behalf of the gods, not just about the gods and not just to the gods, but on behalf of the gods. Then the next one you have are the teachers. And they are reduced to using parabolic or symbolic or allegorical language, because they realize that you cannot really speak about the ineffable. All you can do is use metaphors and allegories of various kinds. And then finally, you have the mystics, who are using what's being called apophatic language. So these are the language of, in Hinduism, neti, neti, X. No, God is not X. Y? No, God is not Y. How about Z? No, God is not Z. Or the language of the Zen koan, where they propose things which are utterly incapable of being exegeted rationally. Like, what did your original face look like before your great-grandparents were born? So there's no rational kind of way of unpacking that. So you're backed into the experience of the mystery rather than trying to rationalize it. So that was the third level that I came in. Then the fourth level was, I spoke then about what might the purpose of parables be. And for me, it is about parables or metaphor, allegory, is about expressing the sacred in the secular language of incarnation. So we're trying to wrestle with the transcendence of the divine. So we're dealing with a sacred or a kind of a mystical reality, and we're attempting now to put it in secular or mundane in form. So that's the purpose then of the parables. And so in some senses, when you think about storytelling itself, basically it has four functions. When you think about Homo sapiens sapiens arriving on the plains of East Africa 70,000 years ago and learning to speak, and they begin telling stories. And so let's say there is a man called Arab Chito, a Kalenjin man, who's hunting in the savannah of East Africa, and he encounters a leopard. Swahili, we call it a chui. He encounters a chui for the first time, and this is a big menacing kind of a creature. And he manages to escape, and he comes home, and they're sitting around the fire with his little group. The typical carrying capacity of a tribe way back then was about 15 to 40 members. And they're sitting around the fire, and the first thing Arab Chito is doing, he's rehearsing what just happened so he doesn't forget what happens. So the first purpose of storytelling is for me to remember the experiences I've had. The second purpose of storytelling is to teach a bigger group of people. I'm going to now teach my tribe, be careful if you see Chewy, they're very dangerous. So the second purpose is to teach others what I've learned from my experience. The third level is to entertain people. So you have to hold them spellbound as well in your storytelling. And then the fourth one is to try to archive it in the wisdom of the tribe or the culture, because stories are the archived wisdom of the group. So when Jesus then specifically is using parables, and he's asked several times, why are you using parables? Why don't you speak to us about the law? Or why don't you speak rationally or scientific language or philosophical discussion? And he gives two different answers. Both of you will find in Matthew's Gospel in chapter 13. The first time he's asked, why are you always speaking in parables? He said, I speak in parables so that I may reveal things which have been hidden since the foundation of the world. In other words, there are some truths which are so deep and so important, they cannot be articulated in philosophical parlance or in scientific language, or in rational kind of thinking. They can only be kind of spoken of in some kind of parabolic form. And the second time in the same chapter, he's asked, why are you still talking in parables? And what he said was, I speak in parables so that seeing you may see, but not understand, hearing you may hear, but not comprehend. Now, why would he speak in such a way that they can hear it, but not understand it, see it, but not comprehend it? Because Jesus is talking about the difference between what I call soul grokking and head grokking. He's wanting his audience to listen not with their heads, but with their souls. And that's why I distinguish constantly between the difference between knowledge and wisdom. Knowledge is data that are generated by the senses and processed by the brain, whereas wisdom is data that are generated by the soul and processed by the heart. And so Jesus used the parables is intentionally to try to engage the souls of the listeners, not just the heads of the listeners. I then went on last week to talk about Jesus as the master of parable and paradox. He's the single greatest storyteller I've ever encountered in my life or in my readings. And like any great storyteller, in order to wake up an audience to some deep mystical truth, you have to exaggerate, sometimes even wildly. He was the master of exaggeration. And he gave the example of, he said at one stage, if your right eye scandalize you, pluck it out and throw it away. Better to enter heaven with one eye than to ever enter hell with two eyes. If your right leg leads you into sin, amputate it and throw it away. Better to enter into heaven with one leg than to be in hell with two legs. Now, obviously, this is a wild exaggeration. And what he's saying is, he's not talking about heaven being the place where blind amputees hang out. He's talking about the fact, that you really, really, really have to wake your audience up to get them really, really thinking and unpacking for themselves, what does this mean? And he's the master of the paradox as well. He was says to anybody who wants to save their life must first lose it. Now, can you imagine an audience hearing that just one statement? He just delivers this one line and he says, anybody who wants to save their life must first lose it. And think, what in God's name does that mean? And he's not going to tell them. You have to go home and figure it out for yourself. What does that actually mean? So in his use of parables, he's well aware of the lifestyle and the day-to-day life of his audiences. And so he's going to create parables from a whole bunch of different areas. He'll talk about farmers. He'll talk about fishermen. He'll talk about shepherds. He'll talk about bakers. He'll talk about winemakers, seamstresses, treasure hunters. He'll talk about weddings and feasts and parenting and friendships. He'll talk about kings and battles. He'll talk about masters and servants. He'll talk about discipleship. He'll talk about talents. And he'll talk about staying awake. So he's going to draw his parables and his metaphors from all these areas, all of which, are well known to his listeners. Now, I do not believe for a moment that Jesus ever explained any one of his parables. If you explain a parable, you're doing the work. It's like giving the students the answers to the test. Nobody's going to kind of read the material. He never explains his parables. When you think of the Buddha, you look at this great story about the Buddha who he's walking around the road with a group of his disciples and he plucks a flower and he holds it aloft. And they're watching, saying, okay, what do you want to say about the flower? And he's holding it, 5 minutes passes, and he still said nothing. And they say, dude, what's the deal with the flower? And then finally one of them breaks into a smile. And the Buddha looks at him and says, hey, you got it. And the truth is that if you really see a flower, you see everything. As Thich Nhat Hanh said so very beautifully, a flower consists completely of non-flower elements. If you took the rain away and the water away and the nutrients and the sunshine and the wind, there wouldn't be a flower. So a flower consists totally of non-flower elements. So the way I put it is that, it is not where you look that's important. It's how you look. If you don't know how to look, you can look everywhere and find nothing. If you do know how to look, it doesn't matter to them where you look. You'll find everything. And so Jesus did not explain the parables. He wanted people to figure it out for themselves. He was kind of in the Socratic school of questioning, except that he's using stories where Socrates is using questions. And one other thing, you will never hear Jesus say, the kingdom of heaven is. He will always say, the kingdom of heaven is like. So he's not giving ontological descriptions of the heavenly realms. He's talking about metaphors and allegories. So they have to be unpacked with that understanding. The next kind of circle I came in last week was to look at the cultural and the translation problems, of taking the language of Jesus, which was Aramaic, and expressing it in our times. And I gave the example last week of a rabbi friend of mine whom I befriended in Kenya. And I was looking at this parable where Jesus says, the kingdom of heaven is like a woman who lost one silver coin and she freaked out. And so she takes out a brush, she's looking everywhere, and she's sweeping the floor, looking at the closet, freaking out until she found the silver coin. And when she found it, she was so relieved that she threw a big, big party for the whole village, and spent a whole bunch of money, because she was so grateful that she found her silver coin. And I'm joking this rabbi, and I said, that seemed to be a really kind of a dumb economic thing to do. She lost one silver coin, and then she spent all she had having a feast for her family and her friends to celebrate the fact that she found this one silver piece. And he says, that's because you don't understand the culture in which Jesus was speaking. So at the time of Jesus, every woman, for her marriage, she would sew 10 silver coins into her trousseau, into her wedding dress, to remember the 10 lost tribes of Israel who had been destroyed by the Assyrian Empire in the year 722 BCE. And so it kept her in contact with her tradition, her religious tradition. But not, and the fact that one of the coins is lost, it was probably that our little daughter dressed up, found her mother's wedding dress, dressed up in it, and started parading around in her high heels and snagged one of the coins, and it fell down and got to a crack in the ground. I know the mother's freaking out because it's an omen, a twofold omen. Firstly, she's being cut off from her people. She can no longer celebrate the 10 lost tribes. But much more importantly, it was an omen that predicated that her marriage was on the rocks and that shortly she was going to wind up being, separated from her husband. And so that's what she's celebrating. It's not the kind of economic value of the coin. So these are the kinds of things we don't get when we're listening to the parables in translation. And the one that I personally experienced most kind of interestingly was trying to translate Jesus' parables into Kalenjin languages when I worked with the Kalenjin tribes in East Africa. And the Kalenjin peoples were nomadic pastoralists, who were being forcibly settled into an agricultural lifestyle by the government after Kenya got its independence on December 12th in 1963. So it's very hard to administer a mobile population, so they're forced into an agricultural lifestyle, of which they have no tradition. I know I'm trying to part of what I was doing was kind of introducing elementary agriculture into the area. It was kind of semi-desert area. But part of the difficulty was when Jesus tells a parable to an audience who is very familiar with the agricultural language, and he says, the kingdom of heaven is like a farmer who sowed wheat in his field. And at night when he was asleep, an enemy came and sowed cockle among the wheat. Now, your typical European and American audience will not get the difference. You know, they have no idea what cockle is. Some people don't even know what wheat is. You know, you think, everything comes from a shop. And so the parable of the wheat and cockle is completely lost on the European audience and on the African audience. Because the thing about cockle, among all the other weeds that Jesus could have mentioned, cockle in the early stages of germination is identical to what wheat looks like in its initial stages as well. So it's very hard to tell them asunder. So it's very easy to be deceived. They look the same. Now, I try to translate that into Kalenjin languages. So we have to make up words. So the first Bible translators who translated the Bible into Kalenjin languages, they took the word bai, which in Kalenjin means food, and the plural of the word bai is bainik. And so they said, no, bainik is, we're going to call wheat bainik foods. And then we're going to make a brand new word, make it up. And the word is chemul bainik, which in Kalenjin literally means that which imitates wheat. So you're beating the audience over the head with the punchline, but that's what you have to do. So there are the cultural and the translation problems as we're trying to wrestle with the parables of Jesus. So having said that, then I zeroed in last week on trying to unpack and exegete some of his parables. There are 46 different parables that Jesus tells in the Gospels. So the one that he comes back to very, very frequently and is really, really important is the theme of the master and the servant, or the theme of the master and the slave, that's kind of the relationship between them. And very, very often you get stuff like the master has one servant whom he places in charge of his property, and then he goes away on a journey himself for a few years. And while he's away, the servant begins to kind of beat up his fellow servants, and he's getting drunk, and he's embezzling his master's property. And then the master comes home, and there's literally hell to pay. Now, this has nothing. This is not a sociological proverb, although it's using sociological reality. He's not teaching that kind of a sociological right of the master to beat up on the servant or the slave. The master is always, in these parables of Jesus, always represents the soul self. And the servant always represents the ego self. So it's the relationship between the soul self and the ego self, or what I call the role self. And so every time you come across a master-servant parable in Jesus, it's the kind of the tug of war between the soul and the space suit. And so the punishment then, and at the end of today's reading as well, the angels coming and separating the good from the bad, this is not a description of an ontological description of hell. This is rather talking about the waste of an incarnation. That we came down here, the ego was, the soul was given a spacesuit in which to perform its mission, and I wasted my mission by beating up my fellow servants and abusing the talents that God gave me. So it's a wasted incarnation. So hell then, in some senses, spiritually speaking, is not an ontological reality, a place we're consigned to for the rest of eternity after we die, but rather it's the waste of an entire incarnation. So that's how I would unpack the master-servant ones. And then last week I went to great lengths and great pain to talk about the parable of the prodigal son. And I remember when I heard this in church for the first time as a small boy, the parable of the prodigal son. And you know the story, I know I don't have to kind of tell you again. But I was always upset that I felt that Jesus kind of messed up the story. Why didn't he stop the story when the younger son, the reprobate, saw the error of his ways and came back and confessed to his father, and his father threw a big, big feast for him? Why didn't he stop the story right there? Would have been a lovely, they all lived happily ever after. But he didn't. He went on and he talked about the older son who came in from the fields and got really, really upset when he heard what was happening. That the young son who'd wasted all his property with prostitutes in a foreign country had come back, and the father is having a big, big feast and killing the fatted calf. And the older son is really, really upset about this, and he refuses to go in. So the father comes out to him and have this dialogue. Now, so in actual fact, that's the entire point of the prodigal son. It's not so much that the younger son repented and came home. That's nice, but that's not the important piece. The important piece was that the father could accept both of the sons. He could accept the older son and the younger son. He could see that they both needed to grow. The older son is dutiful and obedient, but he's a joyless character and he's very unforgiving. The younger son is feckless and is a waster, but he's humble and he can come back and he can become contrite. So the father is able to work with the light and the shadow in both of his children. And that's the great lesson there. It's about bringing together the light and the dark in the experiences of our incarnation. So then I went through that piece, looking at a few different ways in which we create this splitting mechanism. And this is the great problem of incarnation, that we who are unity consciousness, who are part of the divine, we insist on splitting ourselves, both within the person and among us. So it's like the need to split is it's the selfish, fear-based need to feel special. And that leads to separation into me and you, and us and them, and good and bad, and saved and damned. So there's fear-based need within us to feel so special that we have to make sure that we get a joint portion of Father's love. In this instance, Father being God. And I traced a few different kind of ways in which I saw that happen, this splitting mechanism happen, going way back to the beginning of the Hebrew Scriptures. And so God creates human beings in his own image and likeness, allegedly. And he makes a covenant with Adam and Eve and all their progeny. They're going to live in the Garden of Paradise of Eden forever and ever, amen. That's the first covenant. But then they have two sons, Cain and Abel. And Cain kills Abel. So they have a third son called Seth. So now, in perpetuity, this agreement is not made with all the progeny of Adam and Eve, only with the progeny of Seth. And at some stage, God decides that's too big a kind of a net. So I'm going to narrow it down even some more. Of all the human beings, all the descendants of Seth, I'm only going to make my covenant now with the sons of Noah. So there's Noah and his 3 sons and their wives, 8 people who are saved from the flood, and God wipes out everybody else. Now, the covenant is only with 8 people. But then when the flood is over, Noah's 3 sons emerge, and God decides he's just going to choose one of the 3 sons. And that's Shem, who becomes the father of the Semite peoples. And now the covenant is only with the Semite people. And of all the Semites, thousands of years later, he decides to pick out Abraham. And now the covenant is just going to be with Abraham and his progeny, not the rest of the Semites. And then finally, it comes down to Jacob, that it's only with Jacob. And Jacob has 12 sons. And now the covenant is only going to be with the son called Judah. All of the other sons are no longer in the covenant. So there's the splitting that continues again and again and again in the ancient scriptures. And then you have the notion of the Jews and the Goyim, the Jews and the Gentiles. There's Jews and people who are not Jews are the Goyim, the nations. You get the same kind of languaging among the Greeks. So anybody who's not Greek is the part of the what are called the barbaroi, the barbarians. So barbarians are just those who are not Greek. You got the same thing with the Roman Empire. They're the Roman citizens, and then the pagani, the pagans, those who are not Roman citizens. Within Islam, you have the kind of the faithful and the infidels, the good guys and the bad guys. So we have the notion of the sinners and the law keepers, the strict observers, and the kind of the people who don't keep the law. Now, what did Jesus do with that kind of teaching when he arrived? The first thing is he used a family situation of an elder son and a younger son. And he showed indeed that, that the father could see the beauty and the kind of the darkness in each of the sons. He could see the disciplined but joyless and judgmental older son. And he could see the kind of the feckless but the contrite and the humble younger son. And the father accepts and loves both. He's able to forgive their failings and he's able to celebrate their gifts. So he's able to bring both sides together. And this was the great insight that Carl Jung borrowed from Jesus when he talks about the shadow material. That, psychologically, we need to work with the light and the shadow, both within ourselves, and between us. And then to kind of make that matter very, very clear, Jesus reduces 613 precepts of Torah just down to one: love God and your neighbor. How did Christianity deal with this, or how did it engage with this kind of splitting? The first thing was, Christianity now decided that God had finally rejected the Jews and he chose a new people, a new covenant, and it's only with Christians, and Christians are now the chosen ones. God's covenant now in perpetuity is only with Christians. And then when Christianity began to split, Roman Catholicism makes the claim, extra ecclesiam nulla est salus. Outside the Catholic Church, there is no redemption. So not only can you have to be a Christian, but you have to be a Roman Catholic Christian to get to heaven. And then the Puritans kind of fire back, the Puritans and Calvin particularly, and they divide the entire world into the damned and the saved. And particularly Calvin is especially vicious here, because Calvin, when he talked about predestination, he didn't just talk about the fact that, there are some human beings who are predestined to go to heaven. He literally claimed that there are some other human beings who are predestined to go to hell. that God actually created two different groups, one of whom were predestined to go to heaven and the other of whom were predestined to go to hell. So the first group, no matter what you did, you're going to get to heaven. And the second group, no matter how holy you were, you're going to go to hell anyway. So this was the great split then in Christianity. The next level of that split, I call the split between science and spirituality. Beginning with Descartes in the 1600s, the separation of science and spirituality. That science can deal with the kind of the physical cosmos, and spirituality must deal with the metaphysical cosmos. And it's a system based completely on materialism, that nothing is real unless it's sensible in the sense that it can be, in some sense measured by our sensorium or by our instrumentation. Now, gratefully, over the last number of years, there's been a very big counter-movement among some great scientists, people like Bernardo Kastrup, who speak about analytical idealism, that, the mind is antecedent to brain. And then Rupert Sheldrake, a great British biologist who talks about the primacy of consciousness, and people like Robert Lanza, who wrote a series of books on biocentrism, that life is primary and matter is secondary. So that was the next big split. Then the next one I saw was the split between human beings and nature, as if we're not part of nature. This notion that somehow there's raw nature out there, red in tooth and claw, and then there's us, human beings. So this unnatural divide between humans and nature. And it's based upon, in the Judeo-Christian world, it's based upon a misreading of a text at the very, very beginning of the book of Genesis, where God allegedly gives human beings radah over nature. Radah is the Hebrew word that's being used in the scriptures. God gives radah, he gives human beings radah over nature. Now, radah has three meanings. It can mean to dominate, it can mean to exploit, or it means to caretake, to be responsible for. And of course, we've taken the first two, the domination and the exploitation model. So that's the next great split. That's another version of the prodigal sons. And then finally, there's the huge split, the ultimate split perhaps, between the spirit and the spacesuit, between the soul that comes in and the spacesuit, in which it lives out its incarnation. So ultimately, the father and the prodigal son then is the reconciliation of the heavenly and the hellish experiences of incarnation. Every single one of us is going to have experiences in incarnation which are hellish, and we're going to have experiences which are transcendent and heavenly. And the Father represents the ability to somehow bring these two pieces together meaningfully. So it's learning how to discover and identify our transcendent nature in the middle of our own imminent earthly existence. And I finished up then last week by another parable, which I think is basically the how-to of incarnation. It's a story Jesus tells, a parable Jesus tells, of another master who had a steward who was in charge of all his property. And this guy is working for him for years. And then at some stage, the master finds out that the steward has been embezzling his property. So he calls him and says, I found out that you've been embezzling my property. I need to see the books. And the guy thinks, holy God, what am I going to do now? I'm too old to get a real job. I'm too ashamed to beg. I know what I'll do. So he calls in all his master's debtors. And he says to one person, Michael, how much do you owe my master? And he says, I owe him 50 bushels of wheat. And the steward says, here's your bill, change the 50 to 30. And he calls in Julia, says to Julia, how much do you owe my master? And she says, 40 gallons of wine. He says, here's your bill, change it to 20. And then Christ says a very strange thing. He says, the master praised the unjust steward insofar as he had acted wisely, because the children of this generation are wiser to their kind than the children of light. Now, is Jesus praising the duplicity of the unjust steward? Not at all. What he's saying is this, that this unjust steward was able to turn every single situation to his own economic advantage. No matter what situation he found himself in, he was able to turn that into money for himself. And Christ is saying, how come you can't do that? How come you can't take every experience that you have and harvest it for its spiritual potential? So in other words, there is no relationship, there's no situation in which we find ourselves which is not grist for the mill of our growth. And the point of the story is we have to learn how to harvest every situation for our own spiritual realities. And this is exactly the same message that the great Stoic philosophers like Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, the same notion. You accept the life situation in which you find yourself and you harvest it in order to grow and please the gods, in the case of Marcus Aurelius. So to use a metaphor I've used many times, the jigsaw puzzle of life. It becomes really important, when you tumble out the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, a new jigsaw puzzle on the table, you have to make an act of trust that every piece that's necessary is there, and that every piece that's there is necessary. There could be no holes in the finished jigsaw puzzle, or no extra pieces. Everything that you experience is grist for the mill of your growth. Namaste, my brothers and sisters. So let's open it up to a Q&A.
This major transition that occurred in 300 to 325 CE after Constantine supposedly became Christian, and what happened at the Council of Nicaea, it seems to me that there was that the Old Testament supported the Roman way of looking at things much more than the New Testament did, and I'm wondering if that's why it was included in the Bible at the Council of Nicaea, because it had just been put into writing in the first century. I guess the Septuagint was finally, it was an oral tradition up until then, and then was finally put in writing. But as soon as the Council of Nicaea occurred, the Jews became heretics because they wouldn't follow the New Testament, but they'd basically written the Old Testament. And so I'm trying to figure out why the Old Testament was allowed to be included, unless it was because it supported the Roman conquest class system, economic system, much more than the New Testament did, because it didn't seem like the Romans acted in any way similar to the way Christ acted.
So that's a multifaceted question, Tom. So there are so many different kind of avenues to it. So the first thing, the Septuagint, as you rightly claim, is towards the end of the BC period. But the Hebrew scriptures in Hebrew will go back to 600 BCE. So the storyline is there. And the character of Moses would be invented for a people, the last two tribes of Israel, who are between 589 BCE and 539 BCE, are exiled in Babylon. And now the Persians have overcome the Babylonians, and they're releasing the remnant of Jews to go back to the land of Israel, because the Persia wanted a strong kind of flank on their western borders against Egypt. They were constantly in war with Egypt. And so Cyrus the Great, the Persian emperor, wanted a kind of a strong bulwark on his western front. So he lets the last two tribes to come back. Now, during that real exodus back home, they now invent a previous exodus from 1250 BC with a character called Moses, who didn't actually exist. But he's the greatest liberator that never lived, because he gave them the courage to face what they were actually facing in 539 BCE. So about the year 550, 600, they begin pulling together stories from various different traditions. Now, part of these stories are about a god called Yahweh. And now they're kind of trying to make this god the top god. He's their particular divinity. And so they're articulating their belief systems on stories that they've kind of generated as a kind of origin myths. Every culture has origin myths. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb here and talk about, in the first version of my book, I had written a whole chapter on extraterrestrials and their influence, in fact, on human history, and that they were regarded as gods. I wrote a whole section on cargo cults, that any technologically kind of primitive people, on encountering a technologically sophisticated kind of culture, is going to regard them as gods. And we had that happen during World War II, when American and Japanese airmen were landing on Polynesian islands, and the locals regarded them as divinities. Now, I believe that's part of what happened. Now, my editor decided to take that piece out because she felt that the book was too long as it was. And so you've got these separate influences. You've got an ET influence, where different parts of the globe are under the domination of different extraterrestrial entities. So there's these wars going on between these god figures. And each people was kind of swore allegiance to particular divinities. And when it came to Rome, then Rome had its own set of gods. And the Romans were very, very careful when they conquered any new place. They kind of to offer sacrifice to the local gods. They didn't want to upset the local gods, who were kind of regional divinities, or tribal divinities. So they insisted that when they went to some new place, they acknowledged the local gods. And when others came into the Roman provinces, they had to acknowledge the Roman gods. Now you look at the beginning of Christianity then. And so the Jesus movement is a movement among Jews. Every single member of the initial Jesus movement are Jews. And so they've been raised on a kind of a theology of Yahweh as God. And so there's a whole treasure trove then of stories: Moses, the flood, Noah, kind of the Exodus from Egypt, the Passover feast. That's part of their religious patrimony. And so they're going to hold on to that in some way. Now, the difficulty will come when they're now, in some senses, proselytizing, particularly Paul, and they're visiting Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey and Greece and places like that. And they're having converts, people who are coming into the Jesus movement who hadn't been Jewish. And so the very first council of the church is held in 49 AD. It's called the Council of Jerusalem. And when they call it a council, there's probably like 50 people there in a kind of somebody's house. And it's interesting that the leader of that meeting wasn't Peter, it was James, the brother of Jesus. And so you read in the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 15, where Luke gives an account of that first conference. He gives an account and says that Peter stood up. So the question was this: what are we going to do with the Gentile converts who come to the Jesus movement? Are we going to insist that they keep all 613 precepts of Torah, or what are we going to insist on? And Peter stood up and gave his opinion, and John stood up and gave his opinion, and then James stood up and he says, we've heard from our brother John, we've heard from Peter, and we heard from Paul. It is my decision. So James isn't giving an opinion, he's giving a decision, where the others just gave opinions, including Peter. It's my decision that we do not insist that the Gentile members of our community have to keep all 613 precepts of law. We insist only on 4 things. When you look at the 4 of them, they all have to do with blood, because blood is the kind of the source of life. They must refrain from drinking blood in any form, sausages or anything else, because blood contains the life force. Secondly, they cannot eat the meat of strangled animals, because strangled animals still have the life within them, and that's all, that's God's patrimony. And then thirdly, they're not allowed to eat, meat which has been sacrificed to idols. So very often, they'd sacrifice meat to idols and then retrieve the meat and eat it. You can't do that, because it was sacrificed to idols. And fourthly, you must refrain from porneia. And porneia is a Greek word which is often mistranslated. It's not pornography, it is marriage within the forbidden bloodline. So you can't marry a sister or a first cousin or stuff like that. So everything has to do with blood. So James is saying then that's the only rules we impose on them, these 4 rules, the blood rules. Now, that's what's offered then to the Gentile world. Now, the Gentile world is part of the Roman Empire. I know the Romans are really upset that this group called Christians are refusing to honor the Roman gods. They're now in Roman territory, but they're refusing to honor the Roman gods. And that's really difficult, because now the gods are going to get really, really upset that the emperor is not insisting that these people stop praying to other gods. So it's a kind of a divine internecine warfare, such as you find constantly among the Roman gods and among the Greek gods. They're always fighting with each other. So that's then how it gets started. And then this young movement, which is basically Jewish, moving into a Gentile world, retaining the Hebrew scriptures as their patrimony, and at the same time insisting only on these 4 regulations. And they're trying to survive for 300 years in a bloodthirsty Roman regime, which is trying to get rid of them. Until finally Constantine realizes, these are the guys, whatever they believe in is giving them the extraordinary strength to even undergo martyrdom and still refuse to budge. And now at this stage, as you realize from Roman history, Constantine is about to shift the locus of the Roman Empire from Rome to Constantinople, Istanbul, which he then renames in his own honor as Constantinople. And like Cyrus the Great, when he released the Jews from Babylon, have Constantine wanting a strong bulwark on his western flank against the Germanic tribes and the kind of the Vandals and the Huns from Northern Europe. So he realizes these are the group who can do it. But he wants to make sure that they're going to toe the line. So they're going to the first the Council of Nicaea, 321 AD, as you rightly point out. And they're given a mandate of all these kinds of different kind of Christian sects with different belief systems and different versions of the Bible. I want you to stay in the council until you come out with something that everybody can agree upon. And they produced what's called the Nicene Creed. I believe in God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. And only when they create that document and insist that all the Christian sects need to kowtow to that, then he can go. He knows now he's got a strong united front on his western flank. And at this stage then, all of the titles of the Roman Empire are subsumed by Roman Catholicism. So you have, for instance, the title Pontifex Maximus, which was the title of the emperor, and now is the title of the Pope. You now have the jurisdictional regions, like the idea of a diocese or a parish. These were Roman kind of institutionalized sociological divisions of the empire. So they're adopting all of that. And very, very quickly, power corrupts. And soon the Roman Catholic Church becomes the persecutor of those who don't believe. And so at that stage, the years leading up to this, there was some movement, in fact, to kind of separate Christianity from the Hebrew scriptures. But the decision was to hold on to them because most of them are Jewish, and for them, that was food for them. When you learn how to kind of unpack the Hebrew scriptures, as I've unpacked the prodigal son this morning, you realize that there's a literal interpretation, there's a symbolic interpretation, and there's an aesthetic or a kind of a mystical orientation. And that's the whole meaning then of this extraordinary corpus of work called the Talmud. And there are two versions of the Talmud. The Talmud, there's a Babylonian version and there's a Jerusalem version. And what they are the musings and the exegesis of great biblical scholars, rabbis, taking those initial texts and unpacking them in a different way. So it is full of real spiritual food when you know how to unpack it, just like the parables of Jesus are. But if you hear them literally, they don't make any sense. And so it becomes really, really important for us then that we look back to our Jewish origins and the Jewish mythology, and we learn how to unpack it, maybe like the rabbis are doing it, to realize that, like Kabbalah does it, that there are very, very deep esoteric truths embedded in these stories, which when taken literally are meaningless or even kind of repulsive.
Wasn't Constantine, weren't Roman emperors gods? And so did Constantine sort of abdicate that role in favor of Yahweh and Jesus, or how did they deal with that?
So I'll just answer this quickly and then we'll move on. Constantine accepted Christianity as one of the state religions. It was not the only state religion. So he didn't outlaw the others, except they fell into disuse. And so it's interesting, the idea of gods. Yes, the Caesars were regarded as gods, but many of them were killed, assassinated. So the idea of God in Roman thinking wasn't a kind of a supreme transcendent divinity, who was unassailable. It was basically some kind of a higher level of living that had a beginning, a middle, and an end, and could be assassinated. As you know, many of the Roman emperors were assassinated, and some of them committed suicide.
Now, just listening to the prodigal son one, I guess, I'm just wondering, it seems to me that part of our incarnation here is to identify, if you will, or work on, if you will, our shadow material.
Absolutely.
So how do we, as rather than someone throwing it in our face, how do we identify our own shadow material? Because sometimes for me and for other people, I would imagine it's difficult to identify what your shadow material is and how you're supposed to be working on that.
Okay, that's a great question, Susie. And so part of the issue is that I make the claim, and I'll be talking about this in much more depth during the retreat, God willing, is that when we incarnate, we draw members of our immediate kind of circle from two groups, one of whom I call the soul pod, and the other group I call the shadow pod. And so both of them have really important kind of functions. If I were only surrounded by members of my soul pod, I would become a complete narcissist. If everything I said and did was kind of applauded, I'd become really narcissistic. On the other hand, if there's only the shadow pod and I'm constantly being contradicted and abused and insulted, I'd become depressed and anxious. And so it's important to have this balance between the two. Now, I've used this example many times before. I told you that part of my function among the Kalenjin people was to try to introduce them to elementary agriculture. And so what we used was maize. It's because where I live, we only got rain 3 months of the year. I live basically on the equator. So we got, for 9 months of the year, it was like 122, 124 degrees Fahrenheit. And then for 3 months, we got torrential rain. And so we were trying to create a crop that could go from sowing to harvesting in a 3-month period. And I would take them in and I'd give them kind of seminars on agriculture and seminars on spirituality. So the system that we used, we tried to create a very simple system. A group of 4 people would go out into a field. And the first guy had a long stick with a point at the end of it, and he'd jab a hole about every 6 inches, walking just jabbing holes. And the second guy would have a bag of maize kernels, and he'd take 2 kernels and he'd drop it into each hole. And the third person, if the family could afford it, and not every family could, would have a bag of artificial fertilizer, powdered fertilizer, and a spoon. And he'd take a spoon of fertilizer and drop it in on the maize kernels, and the fourth guy would just cover up the hole with his foot and would walk along in a straight line. So after about 6 weeks, the maize would be like maybe 18 inches high, but it'd be full of weeds. And then they'd go out and they'd weed it. And then after 2 months, it would be like 3 feet high, but there'd be weeds there again. And then they'd go and they'd pull the weeds again. And then after 3 months, they'd harvest it. So I would talk to these farmers and I'd say to them, if you had to make a choice between fertilizing the maize or weeding the maize, and you want to optimize the harvest, but you're not allowed to do both for some reason, which is the more important, the fertilizing or the weeding? And the first 2 or 3 years, they were just guessing. After that, they always got the right answer. It is much more important to weed than to fertilize, because fertilizer is blind. It'll grow through everything. So if you just fertilize it, there'll be grasses, there'll be weeds, and a little bit of maize inside trying to struggle for air and for sunshine. And so what I would say to them, that's why Christ said, you must love your enemy. Not that you must lie down and be trampled upon, or not that you can't defend yourself, but to realize that every one of us has weeds in our lives. And if we want to maximize our harvest, we have to make sure we do some measure of weeding. Now, the easiest way of weeding is to call myself to account, counting on a regular basis. So the Jesuits have a beautiful practice. They distinguish between what's called examination of conscience on the one hand and consciousness examine on the other. So you grew up Catholic, so you remember going to confession on a Saturday morning, and you're supposed to examine your conscience. How many times did I tell lies? How many times did I steal candy or whatever it was? And you had to remember the occasions and the numbers and whatever. So you're examining your conscience. The Jesuits said, no, it's not about, what sins did I commit? It is about with what level of consciousness have I lived today? And it's something that I recommend to a lot of my clients, a practice where I say to them, if you're dealing with some issue in your life that you're trying to overcome, when you get out of bed in the morning, kneel at the side of the bed and form the intention, today, during this day, I will really focus on dealing with this issue in my life, whatever it is. And then as you go to bed at night, you kneel beside the bed and you review the day and say, on a scale of 1 to 10, how well did I accomplish what I set out to do this morning? With what level of mindfulness and of consciousness have I lived my day? Now, that's the simplest way of dealing with the shadow. Now, all of us are going to find ourselves in situations where we have different views on a whole bunch of topics, and we're going to be confronted with the disparity between perspectives. So that's another way. I have to examine the reactions I'm having to alternative perspectives. What is arising with me? Is it raising fear, anxiety, anger, despair? What's it rising? So that's my own shadow material. And the last thing I'll say about it is that, and this is very important, when Carl Jung, who spoke a lot about the shadow, there's an entire, archetype called the shadow. When he spoke about the shadow, he said, the shadow is 80% gold. It is 80% unrealized potential and only 20% repressed trauma. So every one of us is born into a family and we have lots of different kinds of gifts. But depending on the family into which we're born and the culture of which we are a part, we'll be encouraged or dissuaded from engaging in particular activities or particular professional outlets. So maybe somebody was destined to be a brilliant musician and the family said, that's useless. You can't make money being a musician. You need to become a financier. And so a lot of who we could become is not activated. So that's shadow material, the potential that's never activated. And then the other 20% is kind of repressed trauma, stuff I'm afraid of or anxious about or depressed because of. So I can get the feedback from myself by the exercise. I can get the feedback from close family friends who basically love me, but see some issues I have. And I can get it from my enemies who will exaggerate widely and take great gaudium in trying to knocking me down. So we have to choose then what is the best way of identifying the shadow, and in some senses, the least upsetting way of doing it.
I wonder if everything that exists in this life, including our technology, is a parable about what exists beyond this realm.
That's a great question, guys. Great question. So in some senses, there is nothing which is manifest in 3D reality of which the archetype is not present at the other side of the veil. So the very simple answer, of course, yes. You know, it represents the archetype. Now, the distinguishing thing is that there's a difference between an archetype and a complex. I've spoken about this several times. So, for instance, the word complex is very frequently misunderstood in psychology. We think of complex as a hang-up. You talk about, for instance, having a mother complex. You have a hang-up about your mother. That is not what Carl Jung meant. So the difference between an archetype and a complex is that the archetype is the pure version, the kind of the prototype. The complex is the finished version. So, for instance, Plato would say that they're ideal forms. There's such a thing as an ideal circle, but you can't reproduce that on Earth. No matter what kind of a compass or a protractor you use, you're never going to get an ideal perfect circle because of the texture of the page in which you're drawing it or the wobble of your hand. So there's an ideal form, which is the archetype, and then there's the complex form, which is the actual rendition in 3D reality. So when you talk about a mother complex, then there's an archetype, a mother archetype, which is this: that every baby is conceived with the understanding and the kind of the covenant, you know, and the agreement that there will be a mother at the other side who will love me, nourish me, give me milk from her own breast, cuddle me, protect me. That's the mother archetype. Now, I'm born to a particular woman, and there is no perfect human being. So the mother complex then is the kind of cluster of emotionally associated experiences that I have around the real woman who calls herself my mother. So the complex then is a very imperfect version of the archetype of mother, and it cannot be like that. So to answer directly then to Denise and Robert, everything in the phenomenological realms, everything in the experienceable world is actually a complex of an archetype on the other side. So yes, of course, all of that technology exists, but in a much purer form than we managed to replicate in this 3D reality.
Yes, I have a question about two phrases uttered by Jesus. One is the kingdom of heaven, repent for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And the second one is the kingdom of heaven is within you. And I'm wondering if time is involved in either of those, and if you can comment about your interpretation of those two phrases.
Right, great questions, Stefan. So the first one, when he says, repent for the kingdom of heaven is at hand, unfortunately, we're reading an English version of a Greek original. So the New Testament is written in Greek. And the word that's used in Greek is metanoia. And metanoia literally means the mind above, beyond the mind. So when he says repent, he's not saying beat your breast and be contrite and say, I'm a schmuck, I'm a schmuck, I'm a schmuck. He's not saying that. He's saying you have to raise away beyond your mind, metanoia, beyond the mind, which is exactly what I was saying there today. That you have to unpack your experiences, not at a literal level or a symbolic level or a rational level, but at a metaphysical and a spiritual and a mystical level. And that's when the kingdom becomes present to you. The kingdom is only kind of active and engaged with your life when you're engaging with it at above the mind level, metanoia, beyond the mind. So it's a typical example of where the kind of the translations absolutely make it prashach, to use an Irish word, a complete mess of the original, which would go beyond your mind, and then you'll get it. So then anything that Christ is saying about the kingdom of heaven then is going to be allegorical. And so the kingdom of heaven is at hand. What do you mean by at hand? It's going to happen in the morning. He's asked at one stage, can you tell us what are the signs? When will we know when the end is near? And he says, I don't know. Nobody knows, not even the angels in heaven. So that in some senses, the divine plan is going to unfold, and it's going to be kind of fed by the actions of various players in the drama. So it's not like there's a predicated end. And when the Mayans, the great Mayan calendar, 2012, where we're all afraid, oh my God, it's the end of times. They weren't talking about the end of the world. They were talking about the end of an age. You know? So there are particular eras in the human evolutionary trajectory. And that's what Jesus is talking about as well. There's an end of an era. And Christ, in some senses, came to begin a new era. If you want to call it the age of Aquarius, the water carrier, or whatever you want to talk about it. So it was a shift in human consciousness. And so I believe that there was a group of souls came in with Jesus I think Mary, his mother, Mary Magdala, and John the Beloved, and that they were a cohort of really, really advanced souls who were trying to usher in the next stage of human evolution. And, you know, for 2000 years, we've been kind of that leaven has been trying to kind of engage with and kind of fertilize the massive dough, sometimes successfully and sometimes not. Personally, I believe it's continuing. So Christ is not a kind of an apocalyptic figure who's warning us to, you know, the end is near. You know, you've been bad boys. You're gonna have to pay for this. He's saying, you know, there's a new era dawning. Can you become part of it? And in order to become part of it, you have to go metanoia. You have to go way beyond the mind. You have to start working with it at a heart level and at a soul level. So every time he speaks about the kingdom, it's the inner realization of both our own divinity and the divinity of everything else with which we share the planet.